Book of Luke, chapter 1, verses 13 through 27. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priest and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures.
One important part of a healing journey can be rituals and memorials. What's the difference between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial? Both built by unfairly paid laborers. Both stand as tourist attractions in our nation's capital. Both remember past presidents who share a holiday so that we only get out of school and work once. What's the difference between a monument and a memorial? I learned the difference while visiting DC on President's Day weekend about 15 years ago. The Washington Monument had its usual line of people waiting to go up the elevator and see. The Lincoln Memorial had families laying wreaths, especially African American families telling the story of our nation's civil rights journey. One had layers of meaning to it. The other was a static point in time. The way we tell stories is often reflected in our memorials. There's good ways to do it and bad. With the Civil War, we have memorialized it with people on battlefields in costumes, grown adults reenacting violence. And we don't seem to be much further along in the healing. The Vietnam Memorial is a reflective wall where we see our face and the names of those who died. It has layers of meaning. It invites us to see a broader picture, to step into the story and see what else is there, to see the story in ourselves as well. There's monuments and there's memorials. There's healthy memorials and ones that can be toxic and keep us spinning in the hurt and the harm. And they shape the identities we hold. How we memorialize something, how we tell that story, how we embody it matters. And sometimes even how we see ourselves becomes too limited. If I have an illness and I survive, it might seem a miracle to some. My identity can become that of survivor, which should be celebrated, well earned. But if my identity remains the one who survived and nothing more, I become defined by my illness. If I'm diagnosed with a long-term condition, whether it's mental health or other, I might be admired by others if I overcome it. If my identity becomes that of an advocate, one speaking out for others who've gone through this same journey, that is a well-earned title of advocate, and it should be celebrated. But if I remain advocate and nothing else in my life, I'm still defined by the diagnosis. If my experience of violence or abuse does not lead me to act out on others, if I do not pass on the harm I've received, no one may ever know it's there. But we allow often those stories to strengthen others. When we share them, others draw strength from it. It can be a blessing and can be celebrated. If I'm ashamed to tell my story or allow it to be the only thing that people know about me, then I am still defined by my abuser. And if Jesus is only known for not being dead, well, it might be inspirational, but we allow the crucifixion to dominate the narrative. If we do not remember the full story, we limit Jesus on a day that should be unlimited. Jesus is seemingly in our culture known for just not being dead. The death and resurrection of Jesus have power. They have amazing power, but not because of the miracle in that moment and on that day, but because of the expectations of a community that was waiting and longing for a Messiah, for something more. Not only that, it has power because of 5,000 people who sat down and discovered there was food when they would have sworn there was none. It has power because of a woman at the well, another accused in public, and many others who, because of Jesus, felt seen and known in a way they could not articulate, but they could articulate what he meant to them. Jesus' death and resurrection have power because he argued with those in power. He called them out for their privilege and for their entitlement. The death and resurrection of Jesus have power not on their own, but because of parables about lost things, shepherds, seeds, and sowers, because of sermons on the mountain and on the plain, because of lessons taught in fishing boats and in the temple. The resurrection of Jesus is the ultimate miracle story, but we cannot allow Jesus to simply remain a survivor of death. Leaving the story here invites us to make the entire story about us. Jesus died for our sins, for my sins. Jesus dying saves us. I know. This is what the secular world and much of the Christian world focuses on. I know that salvation is an important concept to many. But we have to stop at some point and define what salvation means to us. And if we limit it with our personal hell insurance, if that is the end of it, we limit Jesus on a day that should be unlimited. It is almost the way we tell the Christian story, the way we focus on the crucifixion of Jesus. I mean, just imagine you're meeting Jesus after a long time and you go, "Hey, Jesus, how about that crucifixion?" And he goes, "Seriously? Did I start with your worst day when we greeted one another? That's the one thing you want to talk about?" The church is obsessed historically. It is historical rubbernecking at the scene of a crime. It is a glorification of violence and an oversimplification of someone else's trauma story for our own edification. Jesus is so much more. Leaving the story here invites us to account for our own eternal well-being and then forget about others. To forget about the ways that Jesus called us to care for others, for everyone. And on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus visited the disciples, they talked about the events of the past few days. The trauma dominated the story for them. And you would think it should. It just happened. It's fresh. But you know, it's been 2,000 years. And we're still obsessed. Jesus hears them talk about it, and then Jesus starts talking about the scriptures, about the law, about the prophets. Goes back to Moses and carries the story forward. Jesus is focused on the big picture. While they are still ambulance chasing, Jesus is asking where they're going to go next. For 2,000 years, people have been talking about the trauma and missing the big picture, forgetting the call to love our neighbor, forgetting the challenge to feed Jesus' sheep, forgetting the lessons about unclean things that come out of our mouths, forgetting about the unconditional love of God that Jesus came to proclaim in the first place. Yes, 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 you can hear people say, that's all very nice and touching, but I'm saved, are you? How do we get lost in the selfishness of the story? How does the day become all about us and not about God's unconditional love for all God's people? The overwhelming challenge to love unconditionally. How do we miss the message of Jesus in the midst of Jesus' own trauma? Maybe this is the last hard lesson about trauma we need to learn. One of the few things harder than forgiving. One of the few things we struggle with more than seeing others in a new way is seeing ourselves in a different way. Forgiving ourselves, believing we can be more, receiving forgiveness, receiving grace from others and from God. That story of unconditional love, of grace from God, seems so foreign and so hard for us, we would rather end it with the crucifixion and resurrection and just keep that part of the story. Yes, I'm horrible. Jesus saved me, that's the end. That's all I need to be remembered. Because if I dive into the fact that I am called to so much more, then I have to deal with my own goodness, my own insecurities, my fears, what might become, and oh goodness, the potential of what I could be. Now that's a great message for colonizing oppressors trying to keep people in their place while making them say the words of Jesus. But for us, it's nothing more than limiting. It keeps the church from being all we could be, from letting all the oppressed people go free, including our own selves, our own hearts. It's easier to keep it all in the binary, good and bad. We obsess over rules. You followed them or you didn't. We become judge or we are judged. Those are the extremes. As we try to convince our world to be less binary, they seem to be determined to keep it that way for Jesus. Forget the fact that Jesus told people, don't judge, else you be judged. Forget the fact that Jesus told people that it was an attempt to reclaim the heart behind the rules, not refocusing on them that brought Jesus in the first place. That all gets too complicated for us. So we let Jesus wipe out the old rules and we make up new ones in honor of Jesus, including some of the old ones that made us feel really self-righteous, so we kept those too. We forgot the ones we didn't care about and created a new structure around Jesus to judge and be judged by, keeping the whole thing very structured. And along the way, we decided it was okay to judge others as long as our salvation premiums were all paid up. As long as I feel secure in my salvation, as long as I've made my confession and accepted Jesus and gotten saved again today or recently, then I can judge everybody else. That seems okay suddenly in our world. As long as I fit in with the majority culture, don't cuss or hang out with the wrong crowd, I can judge whoever I want because that makes me saved. The Christian Nationalist Church told me so. Easter has become a day to dwell in the trauma. It feels like a celebration. We pretend it's all about life. But when we only allow the story of Jesus to be one of not dead, we're still defining Jesus by his death. When we miss all the things that Jesus taught us about how to live, we might as well have left Jesus in the tomb. How to treat others, how to relate to God, and how to love ourselves. The great commandment that Jesus professed. When we make it all about the death of Jesus, when we give all the power in the cross and not the power to the people of God, we have forgotten what Jesus taught in the first place. We've allowed Jesus to be a survivor of death. And we have to allow Jesus to be more. We have to remember that Jesus' life shows us it's okay to believe in miracles. And it's okay to cry if they don't come in our timeline. Jesus' life shows us that we can be grounded in our culture and our identity and still reach out to everyone from every culture and identity without it risking or challenging or threatening our own. Jesus can show us it's okay to forgive betrayal and seek new ways to love. Jesus' life shows us that we can change the rules when they're hurting people. Jesus can show us how to wrestle with questions, with feelings, and even with God. We have to let Jesus be more than a survivor of death. These messages are too important. The wholeness, the totality of Jesus' life, ministry, life and ministry, along with death and resurrection, are too important to leave him just a survivor of death. And we have to become more than survivors ourselves. That is the invitation. Survival is an important step. That's why we have instincts. That's hot, stop touching it. That person keeps beating me up. Quit asking them for affirmation. Survival is an important step, but it's not the last one. Forgiving, healing, growing, becoming, transforming, resurrecting. These are the next steps in reconciliation with our own heart, with who we were made to be, our own reconciliation with God, and eventually with our neighbors and our society as well. God has so much more in store for all of us. And we are invited to join God on this lifelong journey, constantly becoming more than we thought possible, becoming all that God imagined. There's an old refrain that's traditional on Easter. Bob was whispering it to himself as he came in today. He couldn't help it. It's so entrenched in those of us who are clergy. We've even used it to open our worship service on so many Easters. Christ is risen, and people respond, Christ is risen indeed. It's been echoed through the ages. It's been repeated in so many languages, but it's easy to miss all that it means. It's easy to say it quickly and realize it means more than just Jesus surviving death. It is a response to what is known. It is a response to what is shared, and it's done in unison. Christ is risen, and we can then understand the response as, and we see the power of Christ in deeds inspired by God. Christ has risen, and Christ arose so that we can too. When we say Christ is risen indeed, what we mean is Christ rose. So now we can too, along with the poor, the broken, the grieving, and the oppressed. The abused, the neglected, the racist, the abuser, the self-doubter, the critical judge, our family, the doubter, the wanderer, our neighbor, the people who still believe those other things are true, the person who believes the conspiracy theory, the one whose fears lead them to distrust everyone and act in everyone's worst interest, and those who hurt us personally. Christ is risen, and all these people have risen indeed. And we know it's true. We've seen the stories. History is filled with examples of people who rose up and became more than we imagined. The great stories become books. They become movies. They inspire songs. They become our mentors and our heroes. And on occasion we hear that line, Christ is risen, and we answer from within our own gut and from within our own story, our own journey, knowing that Christ arose, and by the grace of God, so did we. Church, you are more than survivors. You are more than the ones who still attend here. You are more than the ones who used to attend somewhere else. You are more than that. You are more than survivors. You are the wise friends whose words move mountains and even more miraculously move pain and shame. You are the patient listeners whose presence means more than any of those words. You are more than survivors. You are more than your soji, more than your intersectionality, more than your Myers-Briggs, more than your number, more than all the ways we have figured out how to identify, divide, carve up, and define one another in human resource convenient patterns. You are more than the likes on your post, and you are much more than the dislikes that roll through your mind when you look through the mirror. Church, you are more than survivors. You are beautiful. You are beautiful. Church, we are Easter people. And it is time to stop gawking at the cross. It is time to stop rubbernecking through history and dwelling in the trauma story. It is time to tell the whole story. The whole story. All the people Jesus loved that everyone else rolled their eyes at. All the injustices that Jesus flipped over tables and flipped upside down ancient language on. All the people in power that Jesus called out and made uncomfortable. The people who felt unknown that Jesus saw. It is time for us to tell the whole story. The people who became more than they imagined, and those who lived out their encounter with Jesus for the rest of their life, for the rest of their story. It is time that Jesus no longer was just the one who survived death. That's Harry Potter. There's a whole lot more to our story. Jesus is more than the trauma. Jesus' story is the one that meets us in our trauma, invites us to healing, and then invites us to live the rest of the story. Are you ready, church, to move past the trauma and live the rest of your beautiful story?